On August 21, 2002, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, commenced their investigation. As part of their investigation, NIST contracted Underwriters Laboratories to recreate floor models from the Twin Towers for the purpose of fire resistance tests.
We heard about it in the news. We heard about it right away that the floors didn't collapse. Okay, so they tested these huge models. They're models, but they're huge. I mean, one model was essentially the same size and exactly the same as one of the types of floor sections used. And they tested it according to ASTM E119. They exposed it to much longer fire and higher temperatures than we know were present in the World Trade Center. So right away there was a problem. And that's August of 2004.
The report, admittedly, does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable.
We were charged with finding out the cause of the collapse, and we found what happened. I think we've scientifically demonstrated what was required to initiate the collapse. Once the collapse initiated, the video evidence is rather clear. It was not stopped by the floors below, so there was no calculation that we did to demonstrate that, what is clear from the good videos.
NIST commissioned Underwriters Laboratories to do an actual experiment test with fire on floor assemblies. These are model floor assemblies now, built just like the World Trade Center floor assemblies. This is the right thing to do. Do an experiment. Underwriters Laboratories built the floor assemblies, put fire in there, more intense actually than what you would expect in the towers. They beefed up those fires. NIST, to their credit, says, yeah, that's right. The steel does not melt in these towers, but maybe warps enough. So we're looking at the warping here, you see. And of course, in these experiments, where they had these extra hot fires for a long time, the steel did not melt, you see, at all. But what you do have is warping. So you've got these long floor assemblies, and the warping in the middle was about 3 inches, not that much, okay? 3 inches warping. But they didn't fail. So now then what does NIST do? They go to a computer simulation, which is not as good as an experiment, you got to admit, right? Because this is now a computer model trying to get an explanation for the buildings to fail. You know, when they got to the warping, instead of 3 inches, which is what the experiment showed, 42 inches. That's over 3 feet.
My name is Kevin Ryan, and currently technical services engineer for a healthcare company. I live in Indiana, and I was previously a division manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a division of Underwriters Laboratories. The chief executive officer of my company, Underwriters Laboratories, had told the staff that UL had tested the steel, had actually certified the steel, he said, used to build the World Trade Center towers. And found out that the steel evidence had been destroyed from the buildings. That related quite directly to the statements made by our chief executive officer that we had tested steel for fire resistance, and yet the steel had been destroyed, which the evidence would have told us what had actually happened. I first sent a formal question to our chief executive officer at Underwriters Laboratories in 2003, in late 2003. He responded a month later. He did confirm that UL had tested the steel used in the World Trade Center buildings with quite a number of statements that I have in writing. Clearly, this chief executive officer, who was a Harvard-trained lawyer, by the way, not an engineer, had fully accepted the official story and had been given information himself about testing done 40 years ago by our company to certify the steel in the World Trade Center buildings. And he shared that both verbally and in writing with staff at UL. When he wrote to me, he copied several top executives who all have this in writing right now. But he asked me to be patient, wait for the report from NIST, because UL was working closely with them to try and figure out what happened, and eventually there would be an explanation. And I did wait for another year, and the report came out. It included a great deal of contradictory information. They had done physical tests both at UL and at NIST that showed that the steel could not have softened, the floors could not have collapsed. And yet the report was coming out suggesting these things actually did happen. So after a period of about a year, I made a presentation in Chicago where I spelled out the problems with this latest story, official story. They don't really describe the actual dynamics of the buildings falling. They actually just say global collapse ensued. And that way they can ignore a whole lot of evidence that points to an alternative hypothesis, like explosions from witnessing explosions or hearing it, demolition squibs coming off the buildings, the speed of collapse, which is a very important piece of evidence. They can ignore all of that by just saying global collapse ensues, period. The biggest problems with that story are the fireproofing being lost, and I show in my lecture that the tests that were done, very weak and humble tests done by NIST, proved that actually the fireproofing could not have been lost in the buildings. There was no energy for it. There was no mechanism for it to occur. That's probably the biggest problem, is the idea that the external columns would bow inward, which is primary to the official story. There is absolutely no physical testing to support that. And the only support is from a highly manipulated computer model in which, the temperatures were exaggerated, the fire times were exaggerated, all the fireproofing was stripped off, and the floors were disconnected, so that we've got absolutely no actual conceptual framework in which to see columns being pulled inwards. But if the floors are disconnected, there's no force to pull the columns inward. How did it happen? We're talking about a phantom force now in a highly manipulated computer model. So they had test results that disproved what they were saying that happened. There were also comments being made still about jet fuel fires melting steel by experts supporting the official story. So I wrote to NIST and I asked them about their report, and I asked them to please clarify the ideas that are being stated in the media and in the report. And I was fired for writing the letter. I was fired for nothing else but writing this letter.
Kevin Ryan, Underwriters Laboratories, the company that certified the steel that was used in the World Trade Center, in a letter to Frank Gale of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We know that the steel components were certified to ASTM E119. The time temperature curves for this standard required the samples to be exposed to temperatures around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours, and as we all agree, the steel applied met those specifications. Additionally, I think we can all agree that even unfireproof steel will not melt until reaching red-hot temperatures of nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Why Dr. Brown would imply that 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit would melt the high-grade steel used in those buildings makes no sense at all. This story just does not add up. If steel from those buildings did soften or melt, I'm sure we can all agree that this was certainly not due to jet fuel fires of any kind, let alone the briefly burning fires in those towers. Days after writing this letter, Kevin Ryan was fired from his position.
Most of the steel beams and columns came down in sections about 30 feet long, conveniently ready to be loaded onto trucks. These columns were the unique feature of these towers when they were first built. Well, what did the 9/11 Commission report do about that problem? It avoided the problem incredibly by simply denying the existence of these columns, even though those columns, I'm not making this up. So, the Commission report, after saying falsely that most of the weight of each tower was borne by the steel columns in its exterior walls, this supposedly authoritative report said the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped. Such a desperate lie is a sure sign of a cover-up.